All right, everyone. We are going to start Module 6 today. All right? All right. So this unit begins the uniquely macroeconomic content for an introductory economics class. We're going to start this unit by discussing the three main macroeconomic indicators. We'll start today with GDP, and then we're going to go off into inflation and unemployment. GDP is how we measure growth, right? Changes to GDP. We want GDP to be increasing. That's called economic growth. And so, with that in mind, this is the Unit 2 material. Okay? So again, macroeconomics is a study of the economy in aggregate, right? Not just a single household or a single firm or a single market, but all the households, or more than one household, more than one firm, more than one market. All right. They're defining something called a macroeconomic externality. That is not what an externality is at all. That has never been any sort of definition for an externality that I've ever heard. So I'm not too worried about that. But again, economic indicator, those are the statistics that measure some aspect of your economy. And GDP, which is what we're studying today, gross domestic product, it measures total production in the economy or in some part of the economy, right? And then we'll talk about unemployment and inflation at another day, right? Beginning in the 70s, and this is starting to make sadly starting to make a reappearance. There was something known as the misery index, and the misery index was basically the sum of your inflation and unemployment numbers. Now, right now our unemployment's pretty low, but that's either we're going to have to get used to 8, 9, 10% inflation, or we're going to have to deal with the fact that a lot of people are going to end up losing their job. We're going to have a recession. There's just no way around it. I don't know. Well, that's not true. There's plenty of ways around it, but they're not going to do that. For example, they could ramp up production of natural gas and oil. We have the supply right here in this country, but they won't do that. So as long as those items remain short, as long as those items are in short supply, we're going to have this problem, and our only solution to it will be to curtail demand, to slow down economic growth, to actually reverse it, and reduce the amount of demand there is for oil, natural gas, and that sort of thing. The reason why, and I may have already talked about this some, is, but you got to keep in mind that this, what amounts to a supply shock in the oil industry, brought on at least in part by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Not so much the invasion, but our response to it, which are, we've implemented, some measures against Russia as a sort of punishment for them doing this. And because of that, we have less oil than we might otherwise have. I also think it's worth mentioning that this is an administration, right, wrong, or otherwise. I'm not saying they don't have an explanation for why, but they are incredibly hostile to the oil and gas industry, to the domestic oil and gas industry, and they are for reasons that they're concerned about the environment. I think it's a legitimate concern. Don't misunderstand me. I'm just suggesting that one of the reasons why oil companies are not the problem here. It is our domestic policies with regards to oil companies. Anybody trying to invest in oil, that's a fool's errand right now. When you have a administration that's openly hostile to oil and gas, why would anybody put their money on increasing the production of domestic oil, let alone the oil companies themselves? There's nothing there. To motivate, to create any kind of incentive for investments, in my estimations. Feel free to email me if you disagree, but happy to have that conversation with anybody. Okay? But the problem with this is what amounts to a supply shock in the oil market acts as a contagion for the rest of the economy, right? It spreads into the rest of the economy. You have to keep in mind, there are many goods that are manufactured in this country that require petroleum as an input resource, right? As something that you put into it. It's a natural resource, so that would go into the land category that we've talked about. But there are lots of resources that are lots of products that are petroleum based. Anything made of rubber, plastic, fiberglass, right? Those are all petroleum based products, right? So they have to buy oil just to be a variant of oil anyway, perhaps in a different form, but you get the idea. Petroleum, to be sure, just to make their products, to make tires. So the cost of tires just got more expensive. The cost of anything made of plastic just got more expensive. The cost of anything with fiberglass got more expensive, right? But worse than that is even those goods and services that do not require petroleum as a direct input resource certainly use it indirectly to deliver their products to market, right? So anything that has to be, that you have to add fuel to deliver, to get something to the market, it just got more expensive. That's all part of the cost of production. You know, there's still a cost associated with delivering those goods to Walmart so that they're on the shelf when you walk by there. And, you know, this is going to get a lot worse before it gets better in my estimation. And I'm not the only one out there saying this, but I have been talking about this. I talked about this back in May of 2020, when we shut the economy down. What a terrible, 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 terrible idea that was. Bad idea. You can say what you want, and I understand COVID and hysteria and pandemic and all of this. Fair enough. But nonetheless, it's pretty bad to shut the economy down. I'm not sure any rational economist would have ever suggested that we do that. And just to remind everybody, this did not happen with Biden in the White House. This was under Trump. Okay, so, and I thought they had some pretty rational economists there, so I don't know how it came to be that they shut the American economy down, and most of the rest of the globe did likewise. But we are nowhere near recovered from that staggeringly, that unbelievably bad judgment involved in making that decision. We're nowhere near over that. It's exposed all sorts of fault lines in the supply chain, et cetera, and it's led to a whole bunch of stuff. As we acquire more tools in the study of economics, you'll see how just with what you learn in this class, you can predict what's going to happen when you shut the global economy down. It doesn't take any great genius, I can assure you. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to figure it out. All right? Yeah, misery index, 70s, and we're just seeing a revival of this. The same thing happened in the 70s, is there was an oil crisis. In that case, OPEC, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, they cut production of oil, causing a supply shock in the oil market. Oil got more expensive. Well, again, it's used in the production of so many resources, almost everything got more expensive. And then gas got more expensive and a whole bunch of other things. We tried price controls and all kinds of things to get that under control. It did not work. Nothing does, except more oil or less demand for oil. Those are the only two things that are going to work. Okay? And so at that time, this was all a new idea. It introduced a whole new different kind of inflation that we didn't know existed until then. It turned Keynesian economic theory on its head and really just sort of hearkened into an era of a whole bunch of fairly radical at the time, I'm sure, other economic theories. So anyway, we will get more involved in some of this as we move forward. But just to give you some background, misery index is something that came about in the 70s as a result of that oil crisis that where we add inflation and unemployment. And I suspect I've heard a number of people already talking about misery index, and this is going to get, that number's going to start getting higher. Inflation's stubbornly high, and unemployment's going to have to come up quite a bit. For example, in the 70s, in order to get that under control, it didn't happen until like 1981. Then chairman of the Fed had to bring interest rates up to 20% to get rid of 15% inflation. In other words, interest rates had to be higher than the rate of inflation in order to get that under control. We're at almost 8.5, 9. No, that's not zero, by the way. We're at 8.5% inflation. Last month, July. We're now in September, but you get the idea. That's when the number came out. So for that, we in order to get rid of that, I would imagine we need interest rates closer to 10 to 12, 13%. Just saying. And we're nowhere near that. We're at, 3.5, 3.75. Likely going to go up another 75 basis points, which is just 0.75% at least. But then chairman of the Fed Paul Volcker back in '81, he increased the interest rates by 2%. Everybody's setting their hair on fire at the notion that the Fed's increasing interest rates by 3/4 of a single point. He was jumping it up 2 points at a time, and we may see some of that before this is all said and done, if they're truly looking to get inflation under control. Okay, let's move on. I apologize, but I just want to keep this all in context, folks. I'm not trying to drag this out needlessly. It's important. Okay, so generally speaking, our economic policies have three broad goals. We want to keep prices down, we want to keep unemployment down, and we want the economy to be growing. Those are in broad strokes. Those are our goals. We want GDP to be increasing. Right? We want more output this year than the year last year, and so forth. We want unemployment to be at something we call the full employment rate. We'll talk about what that is, but that's about 4.5%, 5%. We're under that right now, but that's more because of labor force participation. We'll talk about that in the next chapter or two. And then we want inflation to be lower. Typically, we want it to be about 2%. So what we're looking for in these goals, we want about 3 to 3.5% GDP growth. That rate of growth can be absorbed without putting too much pressure on prices. An economy that's growing too fast tends to put upward pressure on prices. That's the concern, right? So we want about 2% inflation, 3 to 3.5% GDP growth, 4.5% unemployment rate. That's called the full employment. We'll talk about that, also known as the natural unemployment rate. And then we want about 2% inflation. Those are the goals, and those are just based on historical averages, right? So that's where that comes from. We're going to use aggregate supply and aggregate demand model. It's a knockoff of supply and demand, but whereas supply and demand only looked at the supply and demand of a single product, aggregate supply, aggregate demand, that's looking at supply and demand for everything. Okay, and so there are a number of critics to this model. Anybody who doesn't like Keynesian economics is going to be opposed to that, but it's not strictly Keynesian. There's some neoclassical thrown in there, particularly because of what happened in the 70s. Again, we learned in the 70s that the Keynesian economic theories that had really guided most of economic thinking for the previous 30 some odd years, certainly since, within 5 to 10 years of the early stages of the Great Depression. From that point forward, from about 5 or 10 years after that going forward, certainly through World War II, Keynesian economic theory dominated how we viewed the economy. And when what happened in the 70s happened, which Keynesian economic theory had no answer for, we then had to kind of revise it. It led to something you might hear called neo-Keynesian. Classical economics is now neoclassical, and neo is just a handy little prefix that means new. Who cares, right? But just so you know. And then in order to try to accomplish sustained growth, low unemployment, low inflation rates, we're going to use two different types of policies. We're going to look at monetary policy. Monetary policy is your money supply. You change the rate, you change money supply to affect interest rates. Interest rates, for our purposes in this class, they're going to be the cost of borrowing money. Think of interest rates as the cost of borrowing money. And so if interest rates go up, it costs more to borrow money. Fewer people borrow money. Fewer people have less money to spend. Okay? Monetary policy. We'll talk more about that towards the end of this unit and going into Unit 3 with some of the advanced policymaking topics. Fiscal policy is changes to government spending or tax rates. That's fiscal policy. It's important to note, I want you to remember this throughout the rest of this class, monetary policy is not set by the government. It's set by the Federal Reserve Bank, and the Fed is not a government agency. They are quasi-public, we would say, in the sense that they were created by our government, but they're not the ones who, but they're not under any obligation to, they're not regulated by the government. How's that? All right? They're politically supposed to be independent central bank. The more independence the central bank has, generally the more effective they are. So I'll let you decide if you want to hook effectiveness to level of independence. An argument can be made they must not be very independent because they haven't been very effective here lately. certainly in the last several years, since the pandemic, I would argue. Anyway, fiscal policy, however, is legislative. Fiscal policy requires government to pass a bill. And that's difficult. Remember, we have 2 houses of Congress, so-called bicameral, right? So, and the one that passes in the House has to be the same exact one that passes in the Senate, or vice versa. I don't know which one does first, or if there's a specific order it has to go through. But it has to be the exact same bill, and that's rarely the case, right? But anyway, that's a lengthy process. Monetary policy is arguably more efficient, oftentimes more effective, whereas fiscal policy tends to have a lot more lags and it can be a little bit clumsier to get to have the effect we desire. So that's what we're talking about here, okay? As we start off with this uniquely macro content here now. All right, so again, economic growth is what determines standard of living. It's important to point out here, folks, and somebody tell me if you think I'm wrong. I want your opinion. Feel free to email me. If you're afraid that you don't want me to know that it's you that said it, feel free to send me an email. Create a fake Yahoo account. yousuck@yahoo.com is fine with me. And let me know all the different reasons why you disagree with me. I'm happy to engage in that conversation to the extent that I have the time outside of class to do so. I'd be more than happy to. But the idea that standard of living would improve is a fairly new idea in the annals of human history, folks. I'm not making this up. For 99% of human history, there was no significant improvement in standard of living. It was pretty much constant throughout the entire history of humankind. Standard of living really did not improve very much until the advent of the Industrial Revolution, which was really capitalism. So you can say what you want about capitalism. But capitalism has been and continues to be, in my estimation, extraordinarily effective at allowing economies to grow. Something we never knew. So all of the improved standard of living we enjoy these days, this is not the norm by any stretch. It's not the norm for most human beings that ever existed by any stretch of the imagination. And to be frank, it's not necessarily the norm around the world, because not everybody has adapted capitalism, in my estimation. Again, feel free to email me and tell me why you think I'm wrong about this. But I feel very strongly that capitalism has really has allowed us to sustain a consistent increase in the standard of living. And no, I don't think that's fallen. In fact, I'm going to make an argument later in the semester. Actually, a couple of a few, just a couple lectures from now, after inflation discussion, I'm going to make the argument that not only has the cost of living not risen, but has in fact fallen dramatically. And I think I can make a compelling argument for that. And I think it's incredibly relevant and important to try to do so in this context of a Principles of Macro class. So y'all bear with me. That's coming up here in the next few days, okay? Or certainly weeks. Next week after at the latest. Okay? So, and then of course unemployment, which measures how the number of people who are unemployed, or at least it's supposed to. It kind of almost maybe sort of does. But we'll talk about some of the shortcomings of how we calculate unemployment, and some of the shortcomings, quite frankly, of how we calculate inflation. You can even talk about some of the shortcomings of how we calculate economic growth and using GDP as a measure for that. All right. So again, theories, models. Those are the tools of the economics instructor to help other people grasp some of these fairly difficult concepts. Keep in mind, folks, the economy is an extraordinarily complex and dynamic system. It's not an easy thing to go from virtually no understanding to even a basic level of understanding. It's a challenge. It's tough. Okay. So in micro, we'll use theories of supply and demand, but in macro, we're going to do aggregate demand, aggregate supply. You've already seen supply and demand. You've already gotten that. That's important. That's the underlying theme. But now, instead of the price of an individual good, we're going to talk about price level. And instead of quantity demanded or quantity supplied, we're going to talk about output, GDP, right? And so there are, in broad strokes, there are many different perspectives and different ways of presenting this material. This textbook focuses on some neoclassical theories as well as some Keynesian theories. Again, some of this was necessary to make sense out of Keynesian theory coming out of the 70s, because it did not have a way of measuring, of talking about, of modeling what happened in the 70s with the oil crisis. It wasn't there. Part of the problem is there are long-term implications of Keynesian policies that Keynes never dealt with. In fact, Keynes has a famous quote out there, regarding why his theories didn't really deal much with long-term implications. And he said, because in the long run, we're all dead. Which is true, I might add. There's some, that's a very valid statement. However, there are other people who aren't. I think they're worthy of consideration. I don't get that myself, but okay. Nonetheless, we're going to be talking about Keynesian and neoclassical perspectives here, okay? All right. Again, monetary policy involves managing interest rate, and you do that by changing the supply of money, which we'll talk about how the Fed does it, but the primary, we're getting back to where the primary way they change interest rates, or the supply of money, is by buying and selling bonds, right? That hasn't been the case here the last 10 to 15 years. We'll talk about that when we get to monetary policy module. But it seems to be returning more to the traditional way of managing interest rates and money supply. And when you change the supply of money, you change the rate of interest, right? One of the reasons why, arguably, again, the interest rates have remained so low is because there's been so much money out there. There are really two different models that we use for interest rates. There's one called the liquidity model, which is basic supply and demand of money. For reasons out beyond the scope of this class, you'd probably learn in an intermediate macro more about it, but for the purpose of this class, you don't need to know why it is. It's just the money supply curve is perfectly vertical. Okay, straight up and down. And then, of course, the money demand curve is downward sloping and intersects that supply curve somewhere. So if you increase the money supply, you're intersecting your money demand curve at a lower point, and therefore interest rates are falling. And we'll get into this, but suffice it to say that is one of two different models. I don't know which one this book is going to emphasize. I think they do a little of both. I like both. The other one is called the loanable funds model. And it's just basically draw supply and demand. Only supply, you might add a little tiny LF next to it, and demand might add a LF. The Q down there might add an LF, and that's the supply, demand, and quantity of loanable funds. And then instead of P on the vertical axis, you put I for interest rates, just like you would for the liquidity model. And that's where those two intersect. That's where your interest rate is. Okay. And so, we will talk about that when we get to monetary policy, fiscal policy, government spending, and tax rates. Okay, as we said, GDP is the value of all output produced within a country. It says in a year, but it doesn't have to be a year. It could be a month. It could be a quarter. It could be a decade. It could be a presidential term, a congressional term. It does not have to be in a year. So, the government puts out GDP numbers every month and updates them frequently. Okay, so it is the value of the output of all goods and services that are produced within a country over some time frame. Right. So it literally involves counting up the production of millions of different goods and services: smartphones, cars, music downloads, computers, steel, everything you can imagine, and summing them up into a dollar value. And you can take the quantity of everything produced, multiply it by the price at which each product sold, and add up the total. In 2016, for example, U.S. GDP totaled $18.6 trillion, the largest GDP in the world. Now, when we calculate the value of these goods, we are only looking at final goods and services. All right. For example, there may be a company out there that makes tires, say Bridgestone. I think they make tires, right? Car tires. Well, they sell tires to Ford and other car companies. Is that sale of tires to Ford counted in the GDP? No, it is not, because it is not a final good yet. Ford is going to take that tire from Bridgestone and put it on one of their cars, and then they're going to sell their car, which presumably the sales price for that car will include the value of those tires. That's when that gets counted, see? So when we talk about GDP and we talk about the total value of aggregate production in this economy, we are talking about just the total value of goods, of the final goods and services. The furthest stage of production is what we're talking about. They're either being sold to directly to consumers, or they are an intermediate good, like I just described with Bridgestone tires, in which case we don't count that in GDP. Not yet, not until it gets used, right? Raw materials, input resources. When I talked about petroleum-based products, that sell petroleum to these companies that use it as a direct input, that doesn't get counted to GDP because whatever they're making is going to include the cost of that petroleum. That's the problem, right? So only final goods and services. Intermediate goods that have not been used in some final good or service. They're saying that intermediate goods are counted. That's just not true. I don't know why somebody would say that. Raw materials that have been produced but not yet used in the production, it's not counted. It's just not true. It's just not true. Until I don't want to wander off too much in the grass, but until that stuff gets used and sold, otherwise you're double counting, aren't you? If we count this, just because they didn't sell the car they put the Bridgestone tires on this year, does not mean that we're going to count the sale of those tires this year. That's not true. I don't know why they're doing this. I really wish I had a better understanding. And I apologize, folks. This is my first time ever using this content before, as I mentioned. And so I'm encountering all sorts of issues with it. So I do apologize. I just want to, I don't want to change too much, because I think I've explained this, but the English language is so highly nuanced. I don't want to describe it differently than how the book is describing it. And to the extent that I change something, I'm going to do it live and so that you can see what it is I'm talking about. It's not true that GDP counts intermediate goods and raw materials. That's just not true. Intermediate goods that have been turned into final goods and services are not included in GDP. That's so ridiculous. That's backwards. Those two bullet points need to be in opposite locations. I'm so sorry, folks. So used goods, not counted. If you're reselling your car, it's already been counted. When it was sold the first time, that's when it counted. Okay? Transfer payments. Transfer payments is the econ speak for welfare. So the government giving people money does not count towards GDP, towards total production. However, if you use that money and you buy a new good or service, a final good or service, that will count in the production count, right? In the production summation in our calculation. All right. Obviously, we're not counting illegal goods because we don't know if it's illegal. We don't know what the value of that is because they're keeping it a little quiet. And then non-market activities. There are a number of activities that they do. Okay. So, GDP is the measurement of everything that is produced. So, who buys all this? There are 4 different segments. 4 different components of output. This is what's known as the expenditure approach. There's really 2 different ways of calculating GDP. This is one of many ways of calculating GDP. Okay? So, one of 2 ways, I should say, really. All right, so there's consumer spending. There's business spending. We call business spending investment. Now, that is not buying stocks and bonds. That's not venture capitalism. When we talk about investments in the context of our introductory macro class, we are talking about business spending, talking about primarily spending on resources, land, labor, capital, right? So there's consumer spending, business spending, government spending, and something we call net exports, which is exports minus imports, abbreviated X minus M. Think of it this way to remember which one is which. E exports, I imports, E before I. Exports minus imports, okay? All right. And when you look at this, there should be a couple of things that stand out, okay? That stand out here. You can't... that's pretty funny. Yeah, you can't show negative 2.7% in a pie chart. Sorry, I guess they'd be overlapping there or something. I don't know. That's pretty funny and in a sad, sorry, ridiculous, obscene way. This is clearly not ready for a college class, in my opinion. But nonetheless, you get the idea. There's something that ought to really stand out. for you here, which is that consumer spending is overwhelmingly the relevant part of this calculation. Consumer spending makes up over 2/3 of total output. This economy belongs to us. This economy is ours. It's not businesses. Business spending, as you can see, 16%. 16%. They do not make up the lion's share of what drives this economy. We do. It's our economy. We just don't know how to marshal the forces to manage it well. We can't agree on one day to the next much about anything. So not surprisingly, that we don't have this really down very well. But nonetheless, we're talking about a significant difference in who's really in charge of this economy. We are consumers. You don't like it, you don't have to buy it. Let me give you an example. Several years ago, some of you may remember this. Several years ago, some of the big box stores decided that they were going to be open on Thanksgiving Day. Now, historically, that's the day that everybody closes down and lets their employees spend Thanksgiving dinner with their family. But if you work at a big box store, you have to come back later that night and get ready for Black Friday, right? They open at midnight and everybody races in and they stampede everybody, and there's deaths and mayhem and all kinds of nonsense that go on. Maybe fewer deaths, but certainly mayhemic. Anyway, so a couple of years ago, these big box stores, Walmart, Target, they decided they were going to be open on Thanksgiving Day. And I remember because this was newsworthy, there were some local media. This was in DFW. I was in Garland at the time. And this was here in DFW. There were some news reporters out in the parking lot of these big box stores interviewing people about whether this was a good idea to be open on Thanksgiving Day. And I remember watching as they talked to this one woman who they asked what she thought of it. She said, "I think it's a terrible idea. I think they ought to let these folks go home to their families and spend on Thanksgiving. Now, excuse me while I go do my shopping." Really? I have a guaranteed solution to your concern. I know a way that we can absolute guarantee that they will be next Thanksgiving shut down and have let everybody go visit time with their family. Go spend time with their family. Guaranteed way. Don't show up Thanksgiving Day. You make these big box stores spend money with an open store that brings in nothing on that day. It's all loss. They'll stop. But we won't do that, will we? It's much better to virtue signal and talk about how much we care. Yeah. Not really. We don't. We are much better at virtue signaling than we are at actually caring about anything. That's been the case historically. It's no different than this generation. I'm sorry, folks. You're not. You're not special. You're just as big a hypocrite as anybody else. You got an Apple product? Then you ought to sit down and shut up. If you have an Apple product, sit down and shut up. Don't you dare lecture anybody else about the world. Those Apple products have been made with slave labor over in China, and everybody knows it. Everybody knows it. Everybody. You're going to use it anyway, aren't you? See what I mean? Now, you can't judge everybody else and not judge yourself. Hold yourself to the same standard. Otherwise, you're in trouble. All right? Therein lies the problem. Government spending, it's not that much. In 2016, it was a little bit more. It rivaled business, but not by much. It's statistically about the same as business spending. Notice net exports. There's that exports minus imports. E before I. 2.2 billion minus 2.7 billion is a $500 million. I think that's, no, trillion. Excuse me. 2.2 trillion minus 2.7 trillion leaves $500 billion. 500 billion. Okay? And that's what the net export numbers is. 0.5, 1/2. All right? Now, that's negative, isn't it? Notice that. We run a trade deficit. In other words, here's why this is important, folks. Money that you spend on goods manufactured in other countries, those are imports, right? Those are countries that we import. We bring them into our country, sell them to you, offer them. If you buy those, that's money that goes to the GDP of the nation that produced the good, not us. That doesn't get counted. In fact, it's subtracted from our output. It's very much a drag on our economy. But if foreign consumers buy some of our stuff, then that adds to our GDP. But we consume more foreign goods than foreign consumers consume of our goods. So we run a trade deficit. We'll get into this more at the end of the year, end of the semester. All right? But you can see, again, we're at almost 20 trillion in output. That is a massive number. Anybody who told you that China is now the leading economy, no, they haven't. They never passed America. It's just not true. I don't know where these things get started. It's not true. America is still the number one economy in the world. There's an old expression. If the American economy sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. This economy drives the global. Let's talk about some of the vocabulary we're going to use in calculating output. Durable goods. These are goods that last 3 years or more. A car, a refrigerator. As opposed to, fourth one down, non-durable goods. This is a good that lasts less than 3 years and really lasts a lot less than that. Food, for example. Pizza, for example, is highly non-durable around Dr. Reynolds. Highly non-durable. Inventory. This is good. Anything that's been produced but not yet sold. National income. This is the alternative way of calculating GDP. I talked about the other one as expenditures. That means money being spent. And expenditure is money spent, right? Consumer spending, business spending, government spending, and spending on exports and imports. That is the expenditure approach. There's also an income approach where you add up all the money people make. And that becomes your GDP. These two numbers are fairly close to one another. We're clever in economics, so there's a little bit of a discrepancy between the two, which we just call a statistical discrepancy. I have no idea. That's a little silly. But it turns out we spend more than we actually make in aggregate. Who would have thought, huh? So national income tends to be just a little less than our expenditures. But nonetheless, we're talking about, so remember the four factors of production? Land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. Every single one of those produces a source of income. Labor produces wages. Entrepreneurship produces profits. Land produces rent. They don't have it on this list, but they should have interest. And capital produces interest rates. So produces. You have to pay interest on the money you borrowed to buy that capital. That's how that works, right? So somewhere somebody earned some income from having sold you that. Your purchase of that counts towards the expenditure approach. The money you gave them for that, which includes the interest they charge on that, that would go towards the national income calculation method. All right. Service, again, these are intangible goods like entertainment, a movie theater, right? A hospital. Ranger College. All right. And then structure. I think hopefully you all know what a structure is. If you don't, go back to your high school and go about, I don't know, slapping some of your teachers. Yeah, you should know what a structure is by now, surely. Let's define structure. They don't have much confidence in my students. I do. I believe you already knew what that was. Yep, trade balance, the gap between exports and imports. All right, so a trade deficit is when your imports are greater than your exports. And a surplus is when exports exceed imports. So any country that we have a trade deficit with, for example, China, we have a massive, massive trade deficit with, they're going to have a trade surplus with us, by definition. There's just no way around that, right? And then there's gross national product. Again, this is I don't want to wander off into the tall grass. I don't think it's that helpful or important. I'm not going to ask you anything on, but if you're interested in that, go right ahead. It might be if you're majoring in economics or business, you might want to explore more time. But for most of you, your goal in taking this class is twofold. Primarily, I'm guessing, for most of you anyway, the goal is to get your social science credit and move on. Okay, let's be honest. Fair enough. Then for some of you, you have a genuine curiosity about the economy, especially right now with everything going on. Good for you. I like it. And then I've got tons of high school students who are probably hating my class right now, but there's like 50 of you. For you, this is just an opportunity to earn college credit while you're in high school, which I think is a brilliant system, and I'm a huge advocate for it. I was an embedded adjunct professor at a high school, at a collegiate academy in Garland for almost 3 years before I took the full-time college teaching job. So I'm a big proponent of these dual credit courses. So most of you are not necessarily curious one way or the other, although maybe some element of that, but most of you are just looking to add college credit to your resume. So when you go to apply to your applications, college applications, so when you go to apply for colleges, you can say, you're earning college credit now. It's an impressive accomplishment to do it when you're in high school. And in my experience, my dual credit students outshine most of my college students by a mile. No offense, but they're already ambitious. They're ambitious before they have to be ambitious, and that's not nothing. And so, kudos to my high school students who are taking a class like this. Not easy, but you guys do great at it more often than not. Okay, so GNP I'm not going to worry about. Net national product, again, all that does is it takes your GDP and it subtracts depreciation. Depreciation, if you've ever had an accounting class, you know what depreciation is. It's the loss in value of a good over time, right? So that car you buy loses value over time. Sometimes the house you buy loses value. Usually it accrues value, but then at some point you reach a point where the house becomes less valuable, just simply because it's gotten too old, right? Maybe foundational issues or whatever. A tractor certainly depreciates year over year. The more wear and tear it has, the less valuable it's going to be. So they define it as the process by which capital ages and loses value. Fair enough. Capital, again, is that physical tools that we use to make stuff. National income is all income to business individual. Personal income, this is important, is income made by individuals, right? And then there's this idea of disposable income, which is your personal income after taxes, okay? Not going to be worried about calculating the net national product. This is too important. This is just such an important idea. Not only relevant to this class, but just generally to life and the world. Is the distinction that we're going to make here between nominal values and real values. So if I had a $20 bill, that is the nominal value of that bill, $20. It will be worth $20 10 years from now. It was a $20 bill 20 years ago. It will not matter. Nominally, it stays the same. But in very real terms, that $20 is not as valuable as it used to be, is it? Right? Inflation erodes the purchasing power of your money. And because of that, when you have this $20 bill and you have it for 10 years, it's actually worth less now than it was 20 years ago. And it'll be worth less still 20 years from now. In very real terms, it will buy less, right? So nominal value is the way the book describes it, economic statistic measured using actual market prices. This is important when we get down to calculating GDP, but I want you to understand nominal and real in a broader way because we're going to be talking about nominal and real interest rates. This is a very real important idea. Nominal and real wages, two very different things, right? Your nominal wages are whatever they pay you month to month, whatever your salary is, whatever your hourly rate is. But in very real terms, has your salary gone up? No, because inflation has gone up probably in most cases, in almost every case, faster than your wages have gone up. So in very real terms, you've lost money. You're making less money than you were, even though nominally it's technically increased for most of you, right? Nominal values are not adjusted for inflation. Nominal values are not adjusted for inflation. Real value, on the other hand, has been adjusted for inflation. And it's important to understand. Nominal values is going to be, they say actual market prices. How about current prices? Nominal value, nominal GDP will be calculated in current prices. In other words, whatever the price of the good is that day that we calculate GDP. But real GDP will be calculated in what we call constant prices. We will pick a specific year, and we will use only the prices for that year for all calculations in every year since after to follow. And that way, we're not seeing a change in the prices as we calculate GDP that's based on inflation. We're only seeing economic growth. Okay, really important. We'll do this. Trust me, it's okay. We'll get there. All right. Yeah, see, the problem, so here's nominal GDP. Do you see how much that increased from 1960 to 2010, where it went from less than 1,000, let's say less than a trillion, to almost 16 trillion in the span of, 50 years? That's incredibly misleading, all right? So I think we've already talked about this, but remember, there's that old minus new divided by the old, or new minus old divided by the old, I should say. New minus old divided by the old. There's that growth formula. It's the same one I showed y'all, all right? I think I did. I hope I did. I teach this class in so many different forms. It's difficult sometimes for me to keep up with which class I told what to. So I apologize if I'm redundant or if I tell you I told you something I didn't tell you. So you just feel free to always let me know. I'm always an email away from you. All right. Do try to let me know that you're a Ranger College online student so that I know who you are and where you're coming from. All right. So this is obviously misleading. The problem with nominal GDP is we don't know how much of this increase from 1960 to 2010, from less than $1 trillion to almost 16 trillion. We don't know how much of that is a result of inflation, is a result of prices, of things getting more expensive because of inflation. How much of that is they buy more stuff because they have more money to buy? That's what we want to know, right? So nominal values are calculated. So if you want nominal GDP, you just take the price of a good, current price, and multiply it by the quantity of that particular good they sold, and you just keep adding those up. They got 5 different goods. You take the 5 prices, current prices of those goods, and each one multiply that price times how many of that one they sold, how many of that one they sold, and so forth and so on. And you add all that up, and that gives you your nominal. I've never heard of anything called a real to normal formula. We don't need that. All right. We just don't. Real to nominal formula, I should say. You'll see how this is done. All right. So the simple growth rate, or the percentage change of any two numbers, is new minus old, the difference, the change, divided by the initial number that it's changing from. New minus old divided by old. That's what that is. And then you multiply that by 100 to slide those 2 decimal places over, right? That's just changing from a decimal to a percentage. Because when you talk about growth rate, you're talking about a percentage change. That's what that is. All right? Real to nominal formula, the nominal value of some economic variable is the price level times the real value of that economic variable. Anyway, all right. So for this one here, year 1 and year 2, you'll notice that the price of apples increased a nickel. Apples went up 200, and price of apples went up a nickel. Ignore this column. That's ridiculous. And then price of xylophones went up $2. Ignore this column here. Okay. Oh, I see what they did. The value of apples. That's the nominal. This right here, the value of apples is the nominal rate. The nominal, excuse me, the nominal value is what they mean here. All right, 50 cents times 2,000 is 1,000. 55 cents times 2,182 is 1,200. 10 times 100 is 1,000. 12 times 150 is 1,800. That's the nominal value. I don't know why they wanted to change the wording all of a sudden. All right, so the nominal output is the value of what's produced, while real output is the quantity of what's produced. In the previous, it's not really the quantity of what's produced. That's not necessarily true. So here's how we're going to do it. I'm just going to ignore what they say. The problem with this nominal is how much of this increase from here to here is caused by this increase of a nickel. There was 182 more pounds sold here. So not all of it's just this nickel increase, right? Not all of it is just that simple nickel increase. So let's do a calculation here. All right. I'm going to do a piece of paper and I'll show you what I'm doing. I wish I had some other way. It has a whiteboard. The problem with the whiteboard is I have to use the mouse to write, and that gets, it looks like something written by a chimp. Okay. So here's how to do real GDP. I want to know how much the economy grew in very real terms. So I'm going to use year 1 prices as what we call the base year. That's going to be my year. I'm going to use constant prices. So I know in year 1, nominal values equal real values. In the base year, nominal and real is going to be the same. So I know GDP, and I'm going to put a little sub R there for real, in year 1 is 2,000 total. Now, for year 2, I want to use the quantities, but multiply it by my base year prices. So now instead of 2182 times 55, that's nominal. I want real 2182 times 50. So for that, let me bring up a spreadsheet so that I can. All right, so now I want to do 2182 times 50 cents. And I get 1,091. All right, so real GDP in year 2 is 1,091. And now, again, here we are looking here. They sold 50 more xylophones than they did the year before. And again, I don't want 150 times 12. That is my nominal. I want the real. I want 150 times 10, which is 1,500. All right, which I get as 2591. Somebody, if my math is wrong, let me know. GDP sub R, and that little one that's up above the R, that is my real value for year one. Same as nominal for year one, because year one is my base year. Now for year two, the real value using base year prices is 1,091 plus 1,500, 2,591. That's those two goods. Now I want to know, what's the growth rate? We've established that the nominal growth changed by 20%. What did real growth change? Well, again, I'm just going to use my standard growth formula that I've already showed you. And I'm going to do new minus old divided by old times 100. So now let's plug in what we have. My new number, year two, is 2,591. My old number is 2,000. And I want to divide that by 2,000. I could do 591 divided by 2,000. So let's use my spreadsheet to do my calculation here. 591 divided by 2,000. And that is 2955. And multiply that by 100. And that is 0.2955. Do that and pause that and write that if you need to. So, all right. So that's what we're talking about. Let's look at what nominal growth rate is we add them up. So I've got $2,000 in year one and $3,000 in year two. Okay. So that's that nominal, to calculate nominal growth in that case, right? So all I did was 50 cents times 2,000 is 1,000. 10 times 100 is 1,000. So my year one GDP, because I only made apples and xylophones, is 2,000. That's my nominal GDP for year one. Nominal GDP for year two is 1,200 plus 1,800, or 3,000. The difference there is 3,000 minus 2,000. Sorry, 2,000 divided by 2,000. Well, that's 1 divided by 2, or 1/2, 50%. So nominal growth rate was 50%. But actual growth rate, when I eliminate inflation, is only 30%. 50% jump in nominal output between year one and year two. But my question would be, that does not tell me enough to be able to say whether my economy is doing good. I have no way of knowing whether that nominal output calculation, how much of that is based on the fact that prices increased a nickel for apples and $2 for xylophones. That's not helpful to my GDP. I want to know how much the GDP changed by without this increase in prices. And I do that by just selecting a base year. All right, it does not matter. Okay? All right. Yeah, so here's their nominal calculation right there for year one, 50%. Nominal GDP increased by 50%. What happened to real GDP? Real output has increased. Again, they're going to do it a little different than me, I guess. I guess they did it kind of like I did. Yeah, they did. See, they used year one prices. They're just describing it very strangely to me. So listen to me instead of how the book describes it. All right, you choose prices from any year as long as you use them for each year's quantity. So if there was a year 3, year 4, year 5, year 6, any year can be the base year. But for every real GDP you're calculating in all these other years, you have to use the same prices for those goods, right? And let's see what they come up with. Do they have a number yet? Yeah, 29.6. I said 29.5. I got 29.55. I should have rounded that up. My bad. Hope somebody caught that. I didn't round that up good, did I? 29.6. Okay? But 30% basically. I rounded that up. All right. And that's almost half of what it was for nominal. So you can see that inflation accounted for a lot of the growth in GDP, and we don't like that. We don't want to know. That doesn't help us. We want to know what's the actual increase, right? All right. Converting nominal to real. I don't want to deal too much with the GDP deflator. You're going to have this. I shouldn't say that. There are some questions that involve a GDP deflator, right? So it's another way of going between nominal and real values. okay? In order to see how much production has actually changed without accounting for inflation, you don't want inflation in that, then you need to extract those higher prices, that inflation on your nominal GDP, so that you're left with nothing but the real number, okay? And this is known as a GDP deflator, which is a price index that measures the average price of all goods and services included in the economy. All right? So the price level in 2010 was almost 6 times higher than in 1960. That's inflation, by the way. The deflator for 2010 was 110 versus a level of 19 in 1960. All right? So much of the apparent growth in nominal GDP was due to inflation, not an actual change in the quantity of goods or services produced. In other words, not real GDP. We want to know how much of our GDP has changed because we're producing more stuff to meet higher demand, not simply because it costs more. Okay? So nominal GDP can rise for 2 reasons: an increase in output, increase in prices. So to extract the increase in prices from nominal GDP, we measure only changes in the output using the same prices. That's what we did. So we can use this GDP deflator. You'll want to know this. I'm fairly certain I put some questions on your test about this and in your assignments, so be sure to take note of this. Remember, nominal value of output equals price times quantity of output. That's your nominal every time. Taking the GDP from this, you can do nominal GDP is the GDP deflator times the real GDP. And you need 2 of those to be able to calculate this. And then you can just solve algebraically, right? So in this case, they divided both sides they divided this piece here by GDP deflator. And you get that real GDP equals nominal GDP divided by GDP deflator, and then they reversed them. But you may also want to solve for GDP deflator. All right? How about divide out the real GDP? You can find the GDP deflator by taking the nominal GDP and dividing it by the real GDP. All right? So there's 3 different formulas here, right? There's nominal GDP as the product of GDP deflator and real. Real GDP is nominal divided by the deflator. And the deflator is nominal divided by real. So, but you can do that algebraically. Just need to know one of those. Okay? It's a price index. It's a 2-digit decimal number. It's not a percent. Okay? But we do multiply that decimal by 100 to get rid of the point, but it's not the same as a percent. It's just an index value. It's a way of seeing change a little bit clearer without having to deal with messy decimals. So when you deflate nominal figures to get real figures by dividing that nominal by the price index, we need to remember to divide the published price index by 100 to make the math work. Okay, business cycle, really important idea. All right, it turns out that the economy, it's almost like it's breathing. It rises and it falls. It rises and it falls, right? Ebb and flow of the economy. Again, output grows on average 3% a year, and it has historically over the last 50, 60 years, roughly. 2.5%, 3%. 2.5%, 3.5%, somewhere in that range. But it doesn't do that consistently. It's not 3% every single year. It doesn't work that way. Some years it's 5. Some years it's 1. Some years it's -3. Some years it's 4. Right? And on we go. But the average, so that up and down of the business cycle, as we call it, that's the real values as the economy grows and shrinks, expands, recesses, expands, recesses. Okay? And these short-term movements of the economy, it oscillates between recession and expansion. Now, I wish they wouldn't use recession in this context, because recession has come to mean something very specific to people, and I don't mean, not every single time the economy contracts is it a recession. For starters, economics professors don't declare what a recession is. Neither do, by the way, textbook publishers and authors. They don't declare what a recession is. There's no one definition for that. A general rule of thumb has always been that 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth is a recession. Okay, fine. But it doesn't mean that we're automatically in a recession. All right, there's more to it than that. So I wish they wouldn't call it a recession. I don't know why they do this. Instead, it's an expansion and a contraction. expansion, contraction. But let's use their language because they insist on it. But just know we don't mean recession in the colloquial sense that you have heard it used. Okay? It just means the economy is contracting. It's shrinking. Okay? So the business cycle is this pattern, this oscillating between the economy expanding and the economy recessing. Expansion, recession. Expansion, recession. Okay? And the way it does this is it will expand until it peaks, and then it will recess until it troughs, and then it will expand until it peaks, and then it will recess until it troughs. All right? Those are your 4 phases of the business cycle. Here they are now. There's that trend line I drew for you. All right, on mine. Okay? All right. And this is real GDP since 1900. Because it's in such a confined space, you don't see a lot of it, but you see a little bit of little jaggedness in there. And you can see here was the World War II spending growth. Here was the dot-com growth and the bust right here. This might have been 08 fall. This might have been, this was roughly your Depression era, right? So depressions are a particularly profoundly contracted economy for a long time, really bad. We used to have recessions and depressions a lot more frequently than we do now. We haven't had depressions since the 30s, late 20s, but we have recessions, 1 or 2 every decade, and some are worse than others, but it's not too big of a problem. So it's important to understand that output, GDP, moves in the opposite direction of unemployment. As the economy grows, unemployment's going to fall. More people are working, duh. But as that economy starts to shrink, as it recesses or contracts, more people lose their job. Okay? So when you're seeing this, that expansion, unemployment is falling. Unemployment moves in the opposite direction. And so when the economy starts to contract, unemployment's going to be on the rise. Okay? So a recession is from peak to trough, but again, that is not in the traditional sort of colloquial way we think of a recession. This is the technical term for that contractionary period between peak to trough. We call that a recession, but not because it's a actual recession in the truest sense. The National Bureau of Economic Research declares what is and isn't a recession. They have a business cycle dating committee, hand to God, that does nothing but track this stuff. And they're the ones who declare when we're in a recession. And I got news for you folks. More often than not, we don't know we're in a recession until it's already long past. Let me give you an example. We didn't know about how bad the economy was 12, 14 years ago until summer of 08, summer of 08. And really by the time the presidential election had arrived with President Obama, John McCain's campaign, before that had all worked itself out, the economy was in dire straits at this point. It was bad towards the end of the Bush era. Not because of anything Bush did and not because of anything the Democrats did. They both did plenty to screw this up. It's a long story about what caused this. But there's plenty of blame to go around for both parties. Don't misunderstand me. And for the private sector, for that matter, banks and stuff. And us, individuals, people who bought homes. Anyway, it turns out that by the summer of 08, when we all realized there was a problem, we had been in a recession since December of 07. So it took 6, 7, 8 months for us to even go, wow, this is bad. And they dated it. So they dated it much earlier. So we won't know that the date. I know everybody's already running around, playing Chicken Little. The economy's in recession. The economy's in recession. And we have had 2 consecutive quarters of economic contraction, to be sure. And that is what we've typically associated with a recession, but we've got other factors that are impacting whether or not this is a true technical recession. It's certainly recessionary. It's certainly this contraction that we see in the business cycle. That is a recession according to economics. Okay. All right. Overheating. We describe an economy as overheating when it's growing too fast. If it's growing too fast, this puts upward pressure on prices. Okay. Stagflation. That's what we have now. Okay, and have been dealing with now for the better part of 2 years, over 2 years. Stagflation occurs when you have an economy that's not growing and high inflation. This is the worst of both worlds. It is really bad. It's bad because the only ways we typically deal with this is through demand side policies. That's what I'm saying. We could increase production of oil and gas and solve a lot of it, but they're not going to do that. They're going to instead try to slow down economic growth. They're going to try to curtail demand. Fair enough, but when you do that, you're going to make those contractions. You think the economy has shrunk by 2 consecutive quarters now? Wow. Keep watching. It's about to shrink a lot more. It'll get rid of the inflation, but the economy is going to have to contract. Remember when I told you back in the 70s, coming into 81, when Paul Volcker, then chairman of the Fed, had to increase interest rates from 18 to 20% to get rid of 15% inflation? That led to double-digit unemployment for only the first time since the Great Depression. Unemployment was in the opposite direction of the of GDP. So when you shrink output, you are increasing unemployment. There's no way around it. And if you think prices are high when you have a job, imagine how much higher they feel when you don't have a job. This was all avoidable, folks. Every bit of this was avoidable. What happened in the 70s, not so much. What's happening now, absolutely 100% avoidable. There's no reason for us to have gone through this or to be going through this right now. None, in my estimation. Email me if you disagree. All right, GDP per capita. It's nothing but GDP, that expenditure approach number, divided by the number of people in the country, right? And this is often used as kind of a proxy for standard of living. It's a more effective proxy the more people there are. For our economy, it's not bad at all. For smaller economies, it's misleading. So 10 people stranded on an island, one person has $1 million, everybody else has $1 million. So standard of living for those 10 people would be on average $100,000 a person. Does that accurately describe that economy? That would be GDP per capita? No, obviously it doesn't. So the fewer people there are in the economy, the less accurate, the less effective, you could say, GDP per capita is as far as a measure of standard of living. And by standard of living, we just mean the different things that affect people's happiness. All right? And, being able to provide for your family makes most people happy. Being able to, secure shelter and provide food and clothing for your family, that usually typically that's pretty. I have a wife and son. I have a 9-year-old son. I'm pretty happy when I can provide for him a nice home. He's in his bedroom right next door with his best buddy across the street right now. So couldn't ask for anything better. Certainly makes me happy. Okay. Okay. GDP per capita, GDP divided by population. Boom, moving on. All right, so I'm trying to get some idea about where we are in terms of the end of this, because this has gone on quite a while. So I do apologize. This is one of those longer lectures. There's going to be a few of those. Probably not helped by the fact that I have a tendency to go off on a tangent, but those are good tangents. Anyway, so GDP per capita clearly captures some of what we are talking about when we talk about standard of living, but it doesn't do everything. How about recreation and travel? It doesn't cover leisure time. You go to Half Price Books, you buy a book, a discounted book, that's not going to count. That GDP is not going to measure that, so GDP per capita is not capturing that. It can include what we're spending on environmental protection and healthcare, because it includes government spending, education, all those things. It doesn't include the actual, just how much has that spending helped our environment? How much has that improved health? How much of that has made our workers smarter and more capable of producing, more productive, if you will? That's something GDP does not capture, and there's a point to be made there, to be sure. If you can't see that, that's what that says up there. So I apologize for blocking that. I try to put it in the place that blocks the least, but sometimes. All right. Yeah, I don't want to get too much into this. Labor productivity is important, to be sure, but I don't. For some reason, my face keeps freezing awkwardly in my window that I see. Now it's working. I don't want, certainly not a production function. Suffice it to say, it is nothing more than output per person, right? You're looking at how much they produce, each person. I'm going to be using this when we talk about standard of living in the next a few lectures from now, when we talk about how I can demonstrate that cost of living has actually fallen dramatically. I think. We'll see. So human capital is that accumulation of skills and education for workers. Innovation is just making improvements in products and services based on new knowledge and technology. Invention is just completely new technology and knowledge. Labor productivity, output per worker, it's similar to the aggregate per capita production function. It's basically the same thing. Surely we know what technological change is. But these are all things. Productivity is if you're wanting the good. Listen, there are no good economic indicators for the economy. I don't care what anybody tells you. They're really not. Our GDP, unemployment, inflation, these are all lagging indicators. They only tell us where the economy has been. They don't tell us anything about where it's going. We don't always want to know. We kind of lived last month. We know what the economy felt like last month. Now we can quantify how it felt, but okay. I want to know what it's going to be like next month. How about next year? How about 5 years from now when my son's in high school? I want to know that. We don't have any real good economic indicators for that. One of the best economic indicators, what we call a leading economic indicator, productivity. Look at productivity. Follow productivity. Okay? A really important one. That's what I would say about this. I don't need all that other stuff there. All right. All important, all good, but a little bit more than is necessary to have a basic understanding that I would ask of my students. Certainly, again, at higher levels of macroeconomic study, you're definitely going to get into productivity. You'll get into productivity functions for sure. And they're very useful for measuring growth, for measuring expected improvements in the economy over time, et cetera, et cetera. But for our class, let's not wander too far off the trail here. Okay. A production function is just the process of turning inputs, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, into outputs. Okay. And there you have it. And then somebody will buy that stuff and it becomes part of your GDP. Remember, I talked about how the production possibility frontier shifting outward was in economic growth. That's what we're talking about. Now we can produce 20% more, 10% more healthcare education than we could before because of some improvement. Either maybe we have more money, maybe we have more resources. Something helped. Technology. Productivity, again, it's amazing how much that looks just like GDP, isn't it? This is productivity, output per hour. U.S. productivity growth was fairly strong in the 50s, but then began to decline in the 70s and 80s. Not surprising, considering that we didn't have access to inexpensive oil and gas, before rising again in the second half of the 90s. And that increased productivity in the 90s was driven, in my opinion, by the fact that two paradigm-shifting technologies, really important technologies in their own right, they merged and revolutionized how everything in the world was done. Two technologies: communications, computers, the advent of the internet. I mean it. You guys don't know a time where that thing didn't exist. God knows I do, sadly, because I'm an old man. But trust me when I tell you, it changed everything. It made everything more efficient. You can well imagine how much more efficient the internet is than not having an internet, right? And that's really what led to this increase in the late 90s, early 2000s. And now that's just part of our way of doing business. You can only get so much out of you can only squeeze so much out of the same turnip, right? You can't continue to get productivity gains from the exact same technology. But this has improved. I suspect the next big, huge leap in productivity, you might think I'm crazy about this. The next big leap is going to occur in the space economy, in the commercial space economy. I'm talking about Elon Musk's efforts to go to Mars. He's very serious about that. You know, him and Jeff Bezos, two of the wealthiest people in the world, they both have their own space companies, SpaceX and Blue Origin, respectively. And it's not me that said, it was a bank. One of the big banks produced a report 5 years ago now that said the first trillionaire, I think I told y'all this maybe, I apologize if I'm repeating myself, but the first trillionaire is going to be whoever captures an asteroid and mines it for the resources on that. So it's not just me. I mean, you track these sort of big picture trends, and you start to see. I think the next big leap and consistent gains in productivity are going to come in space. And I think once we have less expensive access to space, there's no end to that. There's no end to the next thing we can do, the next planet, the next asteroid, the next comet, the next thing, whatever it might be. Low Earth microgravity has its own benefits that we can't reproduce here. There's a host of things that can happen once we get that cheap access. Lunar mining, you name it. There's tons of books out there. A whole bookshelf of nothing but that stuff right over here. You can't see it. It's not this stuff. That's typical books, but a whole boatload of commercial space development books. So, productivity gains, to be sure. A big thing. Capital deepening is a sort of generalized econ speak for improving the level of physical or human capital per person, right? In other words, the equipment we use to make stuff and the skill and knowledge we use to make stuff. The increasing those levels is what we refer to as capital deepening. That's what's allowed America to continue to grow. Our economy has gotten big enough, bad enough, mean enough that we're able to provide consistent improvements in those areas. But we're starting to see maybe some diminishing returns. I think some of that is because our public education system is. Listen, folks, I'm not necessarily overtly antagonistic or trying to be provocative for the sake of provocation. But I think we can all agree, tell me if I'm wrong, feel free to email me, that our public education system is in a state of crisis. And I don't just mean the idiocy of some of the things being taught. I'm talking about the utter and complete failure to teach the basic stuff. When you have high school graduates who don't know who don't know anything about the government, don't know anything about the Supreme Court, don't know anything about their country, don't know anything about the history, can't add 2 + 2. When you are graduating functionally illiterate students to enter this extraordinarily complex and high-tech economy, bad news, man. Bad news. And we are. And I witnessed it firsthand. I've never seen a more functionally corrupt system than our public education system. Sorry. Email me if you disagree. Tell me why I'm wrong. I found it to be problematic in a myriad of ways. I won't get into them all right now. I'll spare you my soapbox spiel on the education system in our country. All right. So here's here's the problem with stuff like this, in my opinion. Again, tell me if you think I'm wrong. We noticed that people with high school diplomas fare better in our economy. Well, duh. Right? In other words, people who have accrued this much human capital, they do better in our economy. Going to college, you get even more. Fair enough. That's not unreasonable. But we've taken that to believe if we can just get them the piece of paper, that somehow that's what's going to allow them to be effective in this economy. That's not it. It's not graduating high school that made them more effective in the economy. It's what they learned in high school. When I graduated from high school in 1999, the things you learn, people who hired me fresh out of high school knew I could read instructions. I could compose a letter or an email. Not that we had email back then, but I was young enough. You could count back change. These days we have machines that do that. Nobody knows how to count back change, but I always knew how to count back change. Right? That's what our public education system used to be sure at a minimum we could do. Read instructions, compose a letter, and do basic arithmetic. Those things are not true anymore. And so that piece of paper no longer wields anything resembling what it used to. And I will also tell y'all, and it doesn't matter what it is. It really doesn't matter. You increase the supply of anything without increasing the demand for it, you're going to reduce wages. Yeah, just giving people a piece of paper that says they graduated high school is not what got them to do better in this economy. Giving someone a college degree is not alone going to do it. It will for a while until the employers figure out that, hey, this college degree no longer says what it used to. They no longer have the skills that this college degree used to have. And it's just that you're just watering down the supply. You increase the supply of anything without changing the demand for it, you're going to reduce wages for that labor. You increase the supply of college graduates, wages, the value of those of that degree is going to come down. Period. And pretend that's not the case all you want. So supply and demand applies to labor just like it does to everything else. Growth accounting studies, this is always interesting. Technology used to be considered what we call an exogenous variable, external to my model, but that's no longer the case. Our growth models now incorporate and include technology. Solo growth model is one of the most famous ones, SLLOW, if you're interested, and it now includes a variable embedded in that model for technology. Human capital is arguably as important as physical capital in the process of producing goods and services, right? And human capital, physical capital, and technology all have a sort of synergistic relationship where they work together to help an economy grow. Okay, so the power of sustained economic growth. This is how. Listen, folks. One of the things we're going to talk about with that discussion over cost of living is the fact that we went from employing 30 million people in 1900 to employing 100 plus million, 120 million, I think, a century later. You tell me how an economy supports that much, continues to offer enough jobs to support that many more people. That is an effective system. I'm not saying it didn't have flaws. I'm not saying it's perfect by any stretch. But too often we're guilty of letting good be the enemy of the perfect, and trying to make changes to something that we probably shouldn't be messing around with too much. It will make it worse. Anyway, all right. Rule of 72 is really useful. Rule of 72 says that it's a way of approximating doubling time, if you've never heard of this, right? So you take 72 and you divide it by the annual growth rate, and that will give you the approximate number of years it will take for income to double. So going back to this right here, they didn't put this in a way that you can really do it, but 72 divided by 5 is a little over 14, I guess. So at 5% growth every 15 years, your economy is going to basically double. All right. At 8%, it's going to do it in less than 10 years on average, give or take. I wish they could give them better numbers. You could see that more clearly. Yeah, the Industrial Revolution, that was one of those major inflection points in human history. There's no doubt about it. There's no getting around that. Lots of people don't like it. They don't like capitalism. They don't like industry. They don't, got all kinds of problems, bad for the environment. It's a form of slavery, which it's not. Let's not trivialize actual slavery by claiming that working a job you don't like, not making as much money as you want, is roughly equivalent to being forced to do things for no money. That's not the same thing. It really isn't. I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying it's not the same thing. Let's not trivialize actual slavery by comparing capitalism to enslavement. It's absurd. It's absurd. And then modern economic growth. Again, email me if you think I'm wrong. All right. Global economic growth. I don't want to spend a lot of time here, so I'm going to move forward here. As I talked about earlier, economic growth is a fairly recent phenomenon. I mean, literally in the last 3 centuries of human history that spans tens of thousands of years. It's really been only the last 300 years that we've seen sustained economic growth year over year on average. Right? That was not the case prior to the Industrial Revolution. It was completely 99% of human history. The cost of standard of living was virtually unchanged. I'm not saying there weren't minor improvements, but I don't know. How much did healthcare improve from, say, 1000 AD to 1600 AD? 600 years there, I don't think we saw a lot of growth and improvements in medical science. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you know something about it I don't. Feel free to share, please. I'll share it with the class. Okay? Without throwing you under the bus, I promise. All right. What do you need for economic growth? There needs to be some way of enforcing contracts. And I don't mean a formal contracts. We all have contractual obligations, right? When you go to the store and buy food, you are obligated to exchange your money for that food, right? Otherwise, it's called theft. Likewise, the people selling you food are obligated to not be selling you tainted food that's going to make you sicker, or something, right? They have a fiduciary responsibility. They have a contractual obligation to ensure that what they're selling you, to take reasonable precautions to make sure that the food they're selling you is good and not problematic, not going to get you sick or be detrimental to your health. And so both sides bear that contractual obligation. And there needs to be some way of enforcing that. In the absence of that, then, what do you have? It's anarchy. There's no real guarantee that what you buy isn't going to make you sick, right? So you need law, you need courts, you need those things. I'm not saying that we don't need vast improvements and significant changes in ours. I'm just suggesting that those do still need to exist. Special economic zone, okay, that's just something they made up to sound, again, I think that's more virtue signaling. I'm not saying they're not useful. Of course they are, but that's not typically associated. That's you need to be innovative. You need competition, and you need ways of minimizing the limitations that are sometimes placed on certain markets and industries by government. That would be a case of a special economic zone without them actually saying anything that has much to do with government, I guess, is what they're trying to get around avoiding there. All right. Yeah, I don't want to wander off too far here. You get the general idea. Rule of law, property rights. I know some people don't want to own property. They don't like it. Then whatever. I don't know. I don't get it. I don't understand that. So if you've got an idea of what the problem is with property rights, let me know. Again, to me, tell me why I'm wrong. Property rights provide all of us the incentive to be productive. What's the point in being productive and going to work and making money and doing things and contributing to society if we don't get to own things, if we can't go buy the stuff, if we can't take the fruits of our labor and go buy stuff that we want, whatever that may be, a new car, a home, whatever toot your horn. Okay. Yeah, certainly investing in education, ensuring that savings and investments are secure and you're not being ripped off, right? Not subject to undue risks. There's always risk, but there can't be risk because the guy you're investing in happens to be a corrupt criminal who's going to take all your money. Infrastructure, certainly important. We probably let that fall too far. Argument can be made. Those special economic zones, that's just generally everything else that I'm talking about. Research, all of those things, certainly important. Okay, folks, then we have a quick review that you're welcome to go through on your own time. Other than that brings a conclusion to this one. I know it went on for a while. I do apologize if my teaching style bugs you, but I don't apologize that much. Sorry. Anyway, thanks, folks. Y'all have a wonderful day, week, and I will see you back here for Module 7. All right? Thanks.